Okay, so now I turn to introduce our speakers for tonight's conversation, which is putting the civil back in civil society, a very timely topic. Peter Shergold, Vice President of the Society, former Chancellor of Western Sydney University and former senior public servant, current non-executive director, will sit on the stage in conversation with Kristy Muir, CEO of the Paul Ramsay Foundation and Professor of Social Policy at UNSW Business School, as well as Chair of Alan and Gil Gray Philanthropy Australia. I will leave the stage to Peter and Kristy to take over, tell us a little more about themselves and to delve into this question of putting the civil back into civil society. So welcome.
So welcome. As you've heard, I am Peter Shergold. I am the Vice President of the Royal Society, and I am seeking to extend the number of fellows and members, but particularly where our members and fellows come from in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of ethnic and racial background, and in terms of moving just beyond universities, particularly into industry, the community sector, government, and so on. So I was so pleased. You're now going to join this group. And I'm very pleased, of course, to sit in this position, which has been filled by so many distinguished Australians over the last 150 years. I think it's the first position I've ever held that I could let that slip off the tongue. I was once, a long time ago, what I like to call a real academic, actually an economic historian. I did that for 20 years. And then I changed direction and became a Commonwealth public servant for 20 years, ending up as the head of Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. And now, as Susan has said, I live this wonderful thing called a portfolio career, which means that I am on the board or chair a range of organisations in the public, the private, the government and the academic sectors. So welcome indeed. Well, this week in a Hoyt cinema near you opens the new Alex Garland movie, Civil War, a movie which imagines the United States in the near future being torn apart as California and Texas, in my view, a rather unlikely alliance, but as California and Texas seek to secede from the Federation. It is bold, intense, violent. So I am told. I haven't seen it. Some critics have described the movie as empty-headed misery porn. But generally, I've got to say, it's been well reviewed. It's rating at 87% on Rotten Tomatoes, or technically that's the tomato meter, which is high, no matter what the quality of the movie. My interest is what it's intended to be. It's intended as a cautionary tale of the final collapse of American democratic governance, seen through the eyes of frontline journalists. And more important, its dystopia, which is at the heart of the movie, reflects, I think, the present state of mind in America. And perhaps also, more mutedly, here in Australia. This is what Kristy, Muir and I, with your help, intend to discuss this evening. What is happening to democracies and what is happening to the civil society, which is the foundation of those democracies. But let me introduce briefly the conversation that we're going to have. It was back in 1989 that the eminent political scientist Francis Fukuyama wrote a provocative essay in which he proclaimed the end of history. What he meant was that liberal democratic values had won the global battle of ideologies. And he posited that liberal democracies, which were better socially, economically, and yes, ethically, better than totalitarian regimes, would be the final form of government for all nations. Well, I've got to say, of course, 35 years on, that assessment seems hopelessly misplaced. If you think back to 1989, there were two key things that happened. One was the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, which of course Francis Fukuyama was focused on, and the other was the end of the protests in Tiananmen Square. And you'd have to say, looking back, it was Tiananmen Square rather than the Berlin Wall which seemed to set the seal on the future. If you look at the world today, one could argue that autocracies are winning the battle of ideas, or perhaps more accurately, that authoritarian governments have been able to successfully shut down voices of opposition. But the threat to democratic governance isn't just external. Many Western democracies are now challenged from within by anti-politics, populist leaders, often espousing xenophobic nationalism, isolationist sentiments, and nearly always simplistic solutions to complex problems. More worrying, trust in politicians is now at low levels and seems to be diminishing. And worst of all, political discourse appears to be becoming increasingly polarised. A civil society with engaged citizens, the very foundation of liberal democratic values, at this moment appears fragile. From each side, people point fingers, accusing each other of promoting misinformation. Levels of political trust in Australia have traditionally been higher than in many, I think most other democracies. But with satisfaction with politics in our country now at historic lows, I think it's time that we need to talk seriously about what on earth is going wrong and how we can restore societal faith in our system of government. So to start this important conversation, I'm delighted to chat this evening with a good friend of mine, Kristy Muir. And when I say a good friend, it means we're good enough friends to have very different views on some of these issues. Kristy has a PhD in social history. She's was the CEO of the Centre of Social Impact, which is, you may know, a 4-university collaboration. She did that from 2017 to 2021. And when I was chair of that centre, CSI, I came to appreciate her innovative thinking. She's now the CEO of the Paul Ramsay Foundation. She's a professor of social policy at UNSW. She's a chair of the Allen and Gil Gray's Philanthropy Australia. She's recently written on leadership in a polarised world. And I emphasise that she, like I, are giving our personal views tonight, not any of the organisations of which we're members. So let me frame our discussion. And I want to frame it with just 6 statistical glimpses of the challenges we now face. First, the Edelman Trust Barometer reveals sharp declines in trust across all Australian institutions. In 2022, only 52% of Australians trusted government to do the right thing. Indeed, 61% of Australians thought government was actively trying to mislead them. The same percentage believed business leaders were trying to mislead them. And most disturbingly, I think, for civil society, 65% of Australians believed that the media were trying to mislead them. Second fact, the Ipsos Global Trustworthiness Monitor showed that only 24% of Australians trust government. That's, I suppose, not too bad compared to other democratic countries internationally. It might surprise you to learn, as elections are about to occur, that top of the pops democratically is India, where 52% of the population still have faith in democratic governance. In Canada is 21%, US 20%, Great Britain 17%. Third fact, although trust in democratic government fluctuates, it does seem to be trending downwards at the moment. The Australian electoral study revealed that only 14% of Australians were very satisfied with our democracy in 2023. 14%. That compares to 23% in 2008. Fourth, the primary concern of Australians actually may not be about democracy per se, but the way our democracy is working. The Social Research Institute at Ipsos in 2018 revealed that only 41% of us were satisfied with how democracy actually works in Australia. That compares that 41%, wait for this, with 86% in 2007. A huge decline. Fifth, I think most concerning is the evidence of a decline in the civil society that supports democratic participation. I could look at all sorts of figures on this, but let me just give you one, which comes from the Hilda survey. Because the Hilda survey revealed that the rate of formal volunteering in Australia, and I think volunteering is a pretty good indicator of how civil society is. The rate of volunteering, which was 23% in 2001, had fallen by 2020 to 14%. And sixth and finally, the US is leading the way downwards, although hopefully not into civil war. A 2021 survey by the Pew Center, very respected research center, found that 49% of Americans thought that America faced conflicts based on religious differences. I don't think perhaps too surprising on that. 71% thought that Americans faced conflicts based on race or ethnicity. I think perhaps not much surprise on that. But let me give you the third thing, which is, because I've got two kickers here. The first is that 90% of Americans now think that there are conflicts between people of different political parties. Indeed, in one survey, it is clear that parents with a white daughter would much prefer that white daughter to have a black husband than to marry someone of the opposite political party. That, I think, is pretty extraordinary. That compares, incidentally, that 90% with 50% across all advanced economies, 41% in Australia. So still, at the moment, a big difference between Australia and the United States. But here's worse. 59% of Americans say that their people can't agree on basic facts. 59% of Americans believe they cannot agree on basic facts at the moment. The equivalent figure is 61% in France. That is, it's worse. And it's only, question mark, 41% in Australia. Well, that's 6 big ways to start this conversation, but I think all of those are from reliable sources. So I've downloaded that. Now, Kristy, let's start our discussion, as Tina Turner liked to say, slow and easy. What do you make of all those challenges?
It's pretty... Oh, Mike, sorry. It's pretty depressing, Peter. I think we should all just go home now, really. And, there are some historian peers, friends, colleagues in this room and part of the society. I think if your political science mate was a historian, Yukiyuma, he may not have made that conclusion quite so readily, but let's leave that there. I think there is a serious question for us to ask around how much of a problem is this? So all of those stats are true, and we do have things to worry about. We definitely have things to worry about. And I think, on top of that, there are some other things. We have really big problems with trust inequality in Australia, not just in Australia, but globally as well. We have issues around lack of trust in our not-for-profits, not just in our businesses, media, government, etc. So there's definitely a whole bunch of things that we should be worried about. But to what extent do we have a problem? Because there are also counter statistics that are also going on. So I think there's danger in heightening up our angst around what's happening in this space. Not that we shouldn't be worried. So let's look at a few things. The Edelman Trust Index, for example. The countries that get the best trust scores are the countries that are the least democratic. And the ones that are in the top 5 are not democratic nations at all. So we can ask questions about that. If we look at how trust changes over time between 2023 and 2024, Australia was one of the not so many countries globally in that index where we moved from distrust to a neutral basis. So that is like a positive uptick. And I think globally on the Ipsos Global Trustworthy Monitor, performance has worsened over time, but we are in a better position than we were pre-COVID in 2019. And there are people we trust in this country. So the statistics will also show you that 79% of Australians trust the police, over 3/4 trust our healthcare system, over 61% trust public services, which are all very much, institutions that are important parts of civil society. We know globally, including in Australia, there's trust in things like scientists, teachers, fellow citizens, neighbours. And I think there's cause for optimism in that humans, when we're born, are neurologically wired to trust. So I think that there are some things that we need to also say, what else is going on here? On the decline in democratic and civil participation, I'm also wondering to what extent are we using old measures and old ways of the way that civic participation showed up to assess that we have this problem. So if you take volunteering, for example, we had a massive issue with volunteering during COVID. We lost about 400,000 volunteers in the not-for-profit sector. We still have, for every paid employee, we have around 3 volunteers in this country in that sector. We also have a whole lot of young people and people from different cultural groups, including First Nations Australians, but other cultural groups who are less likely to identify with formal volunteering. And so we're losing some of the stats that we might have seen many years ago. They're just not showing up in ways that we would expect. So I'm not suggesting we don't have a problem, but I do think what we're missing is how are we measuring this stuff? What are our expectations of what we're seeing in the statistics based on what's happened in the past? And what's the narrative that we're looking for in part of this story? And so I do think that those things are important. And the final point I want to pick up, Peter, before we go into more of a discussion, just in response to your introduction, you talked about how much of this is a problem, or how much of the problem is democratic governance or participation in civil society versus how it's working. And the difference between the model versus the implementation is obviously really quite key here. And I do wonder how much of political divisiveness is because the old forms of political affiliations aren't serving the same people as well anymore. How much political divisiveness is because the old forms of political affiliations aren't serving the same people as well anymore. And, the emergence of the Teals is a case in point on that. So I just think there's some of my immediate responses to your opening stats.
Well, let's go neurologically wired and young people. So let's just take that and link that to the whole issue of social media, which, of course, many people are pointing the finger at, is one of the reasons for the polarisation in society. You will remember, and probably were outraged, when Jonathan Haidt in 2019 wrote that book, The Coddling of the American Mind. That young people were being brought up so that they had to be given trigger warnings if they were going to watch Macbeth and so on. More recently, though, I think last year, he brought out, I think, a much more, in some ways, interesting book on the creation of the anxious generation, which I think has got much more persuasive empirical data on it in what's happened to young people actually since the introduction of the smartphones and the way it is fundamentally altered the way that young people are now looking at things. And he sees this is clearly related not just to things like the huge increase in suicide rates among the young people. Young people in America now, suicide is the second greatest cause of death. But putting that aside, he thinks this is fundamentally undermining democratic governance. In his view, the things that really destroyed democracy as we know it was the introduction of likes, dislikes, and most of all, the retweet button. And he actually quotes from the guy who invented the retweet button, who is now bitterly upset that he did so because of the way it is created a sort of mob mentality on social media. So what we've got, surely, is a situation at least where people, partly by choice, but probably mostly because of algorithms, who go online increasingly only hear a worldview that broadly reflects their own and sees that in stark opposition to someone or the other. I mean, how can you keep civil society going when social media seems to be dividing us at every stage?
I mean, the social media is definitely an issue. And I want to, tap into a couple of those things. I mean, we know, social media is one of the reasons why we end up in this kind of 60-second news grab situation, the proliferation of opinions, the immediacy of that fix neurologically of I can get my news or my information or from my social media feed very fast in that 24-hour cycle. It never stops, and it's on our watches, it's on our phones, it's on our tablets, et cetera, et cetera. So there's definitely something going on there, and the algorithms are problematic. I think what's really interesting, and I'm not saying it's not a problem, it is a problem. I think what's really interesting, two things, and I'm gonna contest, because part of the challenge with algorithms is the data that we seek is the data that we get. And going back to how, if I put on my leadership literature hat, research hat, we know that there's a thing called a ladder of inference. So human beings, even before social media, very commonly go and look for data that reinforces the opinions they already have. And we have this thing where it's like, oh, but we're seeking data. Good. There's a new data point which is reinforcing my original assumptions, my beliefs, my behaviours. Now, we've got a room full of academics who are used to going a bit more critically than that. But let's think, even if you go back to Edelman, they separate the groups into two: well-educated, decent pay, etc., and then the rest of the population. So we definitely need to kind of be aware that, yes, social media is part of this. The algorithms are reinforcing what we already think we know. And as a society, as human beings, we get the dopamine hit when somebody reinforces our own viewpoints, and that happens in third spaces. It happens happens online. It happens in the way that people form friendships and belonging groups, etc. So it's something we need to contest anyway. So the key thing around some of these things is how do we disrupt some of this, whether it's on social media or elsewhere, so we are exposing ourselves to different kinds of conversations. We are able to understand where the information comes from. We are able to determine, where does that data even come from? Sally Cripps is here. She does amazing data work. But where does the data come from? Who's getting to ask the questions? Who's actually even writing the stories around the results of that? And how do we start to shift all of those things? So I think social media is definitely part of the problem. I don't think it's all of the problem.
Yeah, but look, they educate people. I've got to tell you, look, we in this room, we're part of the real bloody problem here, okay? People are sick and tired of educated people, along with Hollywood celebrities, business leaders telling them what to do. I mean, surely we saw that a bit in the referendum we've just held. We've certainly seen it in what Trump's great, success is in the United States. People are hearing their own information via other channels, and they are both distrustful and dismissive of these educated voices telling them what to do. It's actually almost contributing to that level of polarisation.
Yeah, and I think that the thing about polarisation is there's a polarisation of the educated versus the non. There's a polarisation of the wealthy versus the not. And I think, one of the things, and it's why I wrote about it at the start of this year, that worries me most is about the polarisation and how do we move a society to see shades of grey, and that includes us. You said we're part of the problem. Absolutely. I mean, how often are you in a room where actually, it feels good? It actually feels good. This is a physiological response. It feels good to be amongst people that agree with you, and or you can have a discussion that feels safer. And there's a whole lot of really interesting neuroscience.
I'm not sure that's always true of the Royal Society, but anyway.
Maybe not with maybe not with this group. But I mean, I do wonder then, like on this point, right, around, we've got this real problem and we should be really worried about involvement in democratic society. I mean, is there something in the paradox of this divisiveness in and of itself for what democracy actually means? Because the whole point of democracy is we can have debates, we can have different opinions, we're willing to go there, we have a representation of, government is representative of the people's choice, and, we follow certain rules and norms around how democracy works, but part of that needs to be we can have some divisive debates, and then we have to settle with, actually, the people didn't choose who we wanted. So isn't this divisiveness part of the paradox of the problem of democracy?
So you think maybe it's just the way we now define democracy. Just go to a ballot box every 3 or 4 years and that's it. I mean, only nerds, I think, join political parties now, don't they? It's a very small membership compared, when I was a young person. So you've got that. They do engage, you're right, politically, including online, in different ways. But essentially, in a way, one of Australia's protections, I think, was what I thought was most bizarre when I came from the United Kingdom in 1972, which is compulsory voting. But, the more I look back on it, I think it, in a sense, saves us from some of the extremes that come with both political parties or a range of political parties where they just got to get the vote out, where, in fact, an issue like abortion can become the key issue in whether people will go and vote or how they vote in the American presidential election.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there is something really great in our history of that piece around, if democracy is about representation, if democracy is about the people making the decision, well, the people should show up to make the decision. And, I mean, the other interesting thing about the political party piece, yes, we've seen a decrease in affiliations with that, but this is actually now a 10-year-old study. 2014, Ariadne from Sydney Uni, but with some others overseas, UK, US, did a study of young people, I think it was 16 to 24 by memory, and they looked at the shift in civic participation and its relationship to political engagement, not to parties, but just interest in politics. And what they found is that the digital engagement in social media, in whatever it was that the young people were doing online, increase the likelihood that they were politically engaged. So I think there are some signs that we're seeing new forms of civic engagement, not just, and interestingly...
But it's a maddening civic engagement. I mean, so many, particularly I think young people, think that you see something you don't agree with, you go online, you state your position, right? Bit of identity politics, proving yourself, and then move on. I mean, Martin Luther King didn't create a social movement by people going online and adding, 3 lines or joining in a mob mentality against someone.
Yeah. I mean, I think this comes back to, okay, so it's like, what are we talking about with democracy? Yeah. And then there's a piece here, isn't there, around, I would say there's a piece here around, what are the values that need to underpin that and how does that actually work effectively? Because I think, just having an opinion, throwing that online and or throwing someone else under the bus because they disagree with you isn't actually engaging in a fair democratic process. And, I mean, if you go back to where democracy started in Australia, the historian in me loves this, go back to the Eureka Stockade. It was basically on those principles of equality, fair treatment by government, right of those governments of those governed to take part in a democratic process. There are some principles that should be in place for how democracy works. And then how do we make sure that that democracy then has trust and accountability and the kinds of things, and, there's plenty of literature on, what are the things that we'd want to see included to make sure this works effectively around, how people are elected, how democracy and democratic institutions, not just governments, function, what they stand for, who they really represent, and then how they're held to account. And there's a whole lot of things within that, which goes far beyond just, well, actually, I'm civically engaged because I'm tweeting this thing that, is, I don't know, hate speech against your particular political ideology, for example.
Well, let's go back. I mean, I noticed when you were going through the values, which I agree with, that helped to go to the Eureka Stockade, many of them values which go to the liberal democratic values, which are the core. I did notice you left out two. One was freedom of assembly. The other is freedom of speech. Freedom of speech. Now, where are you coming on this? So we got a government that wants to introduce a bill, right, to guard against misinformation and disinformation. As I can see so far, it's even, freaking out the Human Rights Commission. I mean, how can we actually deal with this in terms of, people are saying one of the dangers of social media is if people are getting their information from this, it often spreads, conspiratorial theses. You're getting your information out of TikTok or whatever. I mean, where do you go with this now?
I am not the
that
expert. That
was a deep
to
sigh,
comment.
wasn't it?
It's a very deep sigh. It's really hard. And actually, there's a lot of people who are much smarter than me. Like, as you say, Human Rights Commission, there's a lot of people debating who've basically spent their whole careers in these areas and are you can debate these for days. I think there is one thing that I think is important, and I'm slightly like avoiding your question, but I do think it's an important point. The differentiation between misinformation and disinformation. And so often we see those combined, even just the way they're written, mis/disinformation. By definition, they're fundamentally different. Misinformation is an accident. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't sometimes intentional accidents where people just don't seek a source and accidentally retweet something, etc.
It was like the votes.
Yeah,
like the votes
our
earlier.
media, if you're a regulated media person, you have requirements to not spread misinformation. But I think misinformation is an accident, right? It's not intentional. Disinformation is an intentional falsehood for something else. And so I think we importantly need to treat those two things in slightly different ways. Because I do think that they're slightly different. And, we also have to hold on to that notion of where do we hold on to that implied political freedom of communication that we know that, I think that's part of what the High Court's sort of talking about at the moment around if we regulate this, then how do we make sure we hold on to some of those fundamental values, those fundamental principles, and we don't get ourselves into unintended consequences. So tricky.
It is really tricky. And in a way, it does go back to civil society, because part of civil society is, of course, civil discourse about issues. I think we'd all agree that you obviously want to eliminate, complete conspiracies being circulated. You want to guard against hate speech. I think the trouble is beyond that, it gets very difficult indeed to think to what extent you intervene so that you don't insult somebody. Now, in a sense, what we've relied upon is that there is civil discourse in a civil society and that you and I can have a discussion or an argument, and actually it's part of living in a democratic society. I mean, I'm at least of that generation where, you'd go in for Sunday lunch and your mum would say, hopelessly, because it never worked, to me and my dad, no politics, because she knew, by the time you got to the roast bud, there would always be this fear. But that was actually part of what you enjoyed. Now we seem to be divided, so we find it harder and harder to talk about sensitive issues in a way that are appropriate. And I see people, to be honest, I see them self-centering on issues. Transgenderism, it would be a really good, where many people, I think, just think, keep away from that area. Unless you know someone really well, I'm not going to put forward a view that I might have in that area.
There's a lot in all of that, and I think a couple of things I want to pick up in that. One is how do we actually just have open spaces to debate? And I think in some of those open spaces for debate, how do we do that so it doesn't automatically have to be ideologically affiliated? Doesn't mean that we're not ideologically affiliated in our lives or whatever, but how do we do those debates so that we can have those kinds of conversations? Where are the third spaces to have these things, and how do we, if we create things like citizens' assemblies, etc., how do we make sure we don't perpetuate the same people are having the conversations that are already engaged in other ways? And, and I think, one of the principles within the fundamental principles that come out of the UN, they come out of other people that have studied governance, European institutes, etc., around what are the lists of principles you need to uphold for good democratic society, effective democratic society, is strengthened representation. So how do we make, who are these new, and I think we need to do it. We need to work out how to have these forums, but who's actually being represented? Whose voices get elevated, whose voices get listened to, and how do we start to flip that in a way from the voices that were already here? And it's interesting, the opening to this Royal Society around you, Susan, talking about how you're trying to increase the number of women, you're trying to increase diversity in culture, Peter. It's like an example where, it's a third space of civil society where it's actually how do we start to hear different kinds of voices. So I think we definitely need to look at where do we create these spaces for different kinds of conversations, and how do we make sure they just don't reinforce what we already have in terms of those inequities. And part of that means different ways of engaging, different places to engage, but also what's the will that we show up with to do this. Because I think the other thing on will that I think, and you said we're part of this problem. One of my favourite mathematical formulas, not a proper mathematician like our colleague that just got an award, but is around deep listening. And I think that, as humans, most people will say they're really good above average listeners. About 74% say they're above average listener. But actually the same proportion say they're a good driver. And we know how that shows up, right? So, but on the deep listening front, even those of us who are well educated, it's really tricky because on average humans speak at 125 words a minute. We can listen at 400 words a minute, and we think at 900 words a minute. So often, before you've even got out your 125 words a minute, I've already disengaged from you because I've disagreed with you. My brain's bored. I'm distracted. I'm thinking about what's for dinner. I'm thinking about whatever else. And I'm also thinking, I don't like you very much because we don't agree on a political front. And all of a sudden, I'm not even listening to what your next argument is. So I think there's part of how do we create spaces? How do we make sure we have broader representation? And how do we all as humans show up and work out how we do better listening and knowing that we're going to be triggered by all of those other distractions that are happening?
Now, this is recorded for posterity, so I'm going to say how right you are. Although I have to say that whenever I think I'm deep listening, my wife says you're just snoozing. But anyway, but look, I think the issue you started that with is so right, because people are saying, well, let's think of different forms of democratic participation, citizens, juries, town hall meetings, even the notion of sort of selecting people randomly to participate in discussions of major issues. Now, incidentally, I think a lot of that is really good and can work. But even if you select people randomly, you get a group of people, 100 people selected randomly to discuss the issue of what you're going to do with nuclear waste, for example. It's still not, the dynamics is not going to be that everybody is equal in that discussion.
Yeah. And so that piece to me is so interesting. And how does that then mean that you have different kinds of voices? I mean, one of the privileges of my current role is I spend so much time going to all sorts of different communities, our foundation, our goal is to enable people and places to thrive and to stop the perpetuation of disadvantage. And so we go into different communities. And I know, Peter, in your various hats and various roles, you spend a lot of time with different people in different communities. You know, people in places are incredibly wise and resourceful. And you go in and you spend time listening to those voices in all sorts of different formats. And that might be out in the middle of Northeast Arnhem Land, in the desert somewhere, sitting around a campfire, and you can have the most incredible yarning circles, and the wisdom and the ideas and the solutions for all sorts of things are so embedded in the community, and they're actively participating. They're volunteering like every day, but it's not in our stats. They've got incredible ideas as to what needs to happen when, in what order. They're wrapping their arms around the kids, the young people, that, you know, and so I think that we have enough examples across the country where things are really quite incredible. And when we start to create these new spaces, to your point, how do we make sure that it's not just representative of who shows up, but it's representative in how we listen, whose voice gets listened to, and then also, you know, who gets to tell the stories afterwards, in whose words, because that matters too.
Well, and who gets to convert them into public policy. But
Yes.
now, I think it's time probably we can take questions. I'm going to ask you a question at the end, though, is what the hell are we going to do about this? And I'll ask myself the same question. I haven't thought about it yet. But I think in the meantime, let's take some questions from the floor.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions. And I've got one, but I might leave mine to a bit later still, because I know there'll be some questions. Who would like to open the batting? Here. One, two.
Okay, I'm glad to be able to open, because this is definitely a contribution to analysing the fact that society is indeed becoming less civil, rather than a contribution to what do we do about it. My central point is that society as a whole is being stressed by the overarching issue of climate change. Now, this affects you differently depending on whether you actually believe the science or you don't. So if you're in the perhaps half the population who believe the science, then there is this ever increasing sense of frustration and desperation that we are clearly losing the battle to do something about it. If you're on the other side, if you're among those who don't believe in the science, then it affects you differently. You're in the situation where it's the elites who are telling you that this is the case, whereas in your daily run-of-the-mill life, you can still see that everything is perfectly bloody normal, and therefore they are obviously wrong. And so for both sides of the debate on climate change, you have this increasing sense of frustration. And of course, this is also an issue where the democracies are supremely unfitted to do anything about it, because of the extent to which those in power are more concerned to win the next election, which of course in Australia is always less than 3 years away, whereas climate change is an issue with a timescale measured in many decades. So
you think for a moment, and I'm going to say right up, I think your question is part of the problem. And your question is part of the problem because the way you immediately thought, there's two sides on climate change. I'm very sensitive to this. Some of you may know, remember back to 2006-07, I was given what seemed to be the impossible task in PM&C of chairing a group to look at emissions trading as a response. And everybody assumed this was just John Howard kicking it down past the election. And as it happens, some of you may remember, that actually John Howard ended up embracing an emissions trading scheme, okay, to be introduced, I think, in 2011, 2012. How politics gets in the way. But immediately I had done that, people said, well, we wouldn't have expected that for you, working for John Howard in PM&C, coming out supporting a market-driven emissions trading scheme. Okay, that's your one side. Then when I said, for example, that as one part of the solution, a global solution, not necessarily an Australian solution, we should look at nuclear energy, at least as a transition fuel, then people say, oh no, you see, you're still just the same, you're on that side. The difficulty is, I think, and I don't think it's just because I was a public servant for 20 years, on most issues we discuss, including the issues we discuss at the Royal Society, there isn't a which side are you on. The whole point is they're complex. We're complex and we have different views. And the difficulty is that's happening, I think, to which social media is contributing, it's not the only thing, is this demarcation that there is a particular view here and a particular view there, rather than seeing that most of us, on most issues, have what we might describe as crossover views. It's not necessarily centrist, but it's actually understanding part of other people's arguments. So that's, I think, the challenge we're actually facing at the moment.
I mean, I agree with Peter. And it's not just climate change; it's all sorts of any issue that is complex, that's not linear, that has lots of things going on, that's sitting within the context of people's other day-to-day lives. There are shades of grey all over the shop. What else is going on here? You know, I mean, I think one of the interesting spaces at the moment is around just transitions for communities where they are more exposed to climate change and they're also more vulnerable to start with. And actually, if that's, you know, if you have had generations of this is how our family has been able to feed our kids, you know, then it is a more of a complex issue. It doesn't mean we can't solve it. How do we come together? How do we have different conversations? And, you know, and I remember sitting down with somebody and we had about a 40-minute conversation about this is changing tack to climate change, but it's the same principle of how do you have these conversations. During the voice referendum, and somebody was so angry about their particular viewpoint, and I sat with them and I said, it was literally like, tell me more. Tell me why, tell me more. I can see you're really upset. Tell me why you're upset about this. And how do you understand where those values are coming from? What's really going on? It's really hard work. We need the skills to be able to do this.
Perhaps you should say, perhaps it would help to say who you are.
Yes, of course. Michael De Percy from the Southern Highlands branch. My first time here, so thank you very much. A great conversation. I'm a political scientist. Let me just say that at the beginning. Now, Francis Fukuyama had another bite at the cherry and said identity politics was the next big problem. And when we look at On Liberty from John Stuart Mill, which if we read now, it's almost like reading How We Do Things, but there was a counterpoint written by James Fitzjames Stephen, and he suggested that extreme liberalism in the Mill sense would actually lead to a problem with the common good. Now, this was a conversation about civil society, and if we go back to Hobbes and civil society as being not an animal society, where we give up some of our rights in order to protect ourselves and each other through a government, and obviously with our certain liberal liberties and so forth, is not then the problem that we're not actually talking about what is central to liberal democratic practice, which is the idea of the common good. Now, a civil society is all about achieving the common good. We don't talk about the common good anymore. We don't even know what it means. And why are we not talking about it? And I guess my question is, do you think a refocus onto a general idea of the common good would help overcome the polarisation? Thank you.
That was beautiful, and I completely agree. I mean, part of that piece around how do you have good democracy is where are there common purposes that we share. The common good is one, and I think I could go into a whole thing about ethics, but I do want to pick up something different than the ethics piece, which relates to how do we recraft some of our narratives. And there's a really interesting organisation in the US called the Frameworks Institute, and they have looked for many years, the last 16 years, at what are the things that are holding back social progress. And the three things that keep coming up all the time, again and again, is individualism, you know, the counter to some of that common good, fatalism, even us starting this whole thing of, whoa, this is terrible, isn't this terrible? Let's go home and tell everyone how terrible this is just going to perpetuate that it's terrible. Lots of the young people that I've worked with over decades don't know they're homeless till someone goes, by the way, Peter, you're homeless. And they're like, oh my God, this is terrible. So fatalism is a problem. And then I'm just trying to, and then the third one, which is the whole point of the polarisation conversation, is the us versus them. So if we can move away from individualism, fatalism, us versus them, to move to some kind of back to the common good, then I think that's definitely a piece to the puzzle that would help to solve this.
And thinking back to, I thought that was a really good question, John Stuart Mill's and liberty. As I remember, and the common good, one of his other issues, I think I'm right in saying, was that civil society is actually the realm of liberty. That's the area where it should play out. I think you're right, we do need to go back and reimagine actually not so much democratic governance as what the common good means in society. If you think about it, and all that has been said by Fukuyama on identity politics, and, which may have worryingly played out a couple of days ago, with people identifying with a particular faith, a particular ethnicity, and so on. On the whole, we've done, I think, an extraordinary job in Australia over 3 generations, which I suspect most Australians in 1947 wouldn't have believed possible, of creating a genuine multicultural society in which actually one of the ways we identify ourselves as Australian is through the ethnic diversity that is us. In fact, the part we're struggling with, I think most of all, most profoundly, is our First Nations, our First People, and how they relate to that. But I think we need to go back to thinking, what does the common good mean in terms of the way we want society to function? And I think the other thing is to realise that the common good is not just what governments do. If you think about our lives, government is everywhere, but most of the place is invisible. When we go into a shop or a hotel, we're not thinking, are they keeping, safe food standards here? Or are there fire escapes available? Government has actually made sure they are, but it's invisible. And in a way, that's when government is best. And what we think of then as the common good is what each of us contribute to society in different ways. To some, it may be getting involved politically. To many others, it will just be going along to do the Saturday afternoon soccer refereeing or whatever it is. I do think we need to go back. In fact, I think we need to probably stop talking about democracy and democratic governance and go back to that notion of common good or civil society, which is why I put that really in the title of this evening's discussion.
Okay, we'll go over to Robert.
Yes, thank you very much. Bob Whittaker here, sometime Hunter Branch rep on council. I've got a question for you, and as my children have now grown up and I've looked at their education, things have changed. I went to a public school, Wattawa Heights Public, and in 5th class, Mr. Metcalf said, okay, you've got to know how the system works. It was explained to us, the difference between the states. It was explained to us how they all had their own parliaments before federation, and that's why Tassie got the same number of senators as New South Wales. The mechanics of it was explained. Whereas to my children, when they went through, values were discussed. Now, I'm not going to say the latter's wrong, but I will say you can't really participate unless you know how the place works. Your thoughts?
Well, at a recent board meeting with Mike Baird, I think I shocked him by saying that I really only had 2 really boring subjects at school. One was sex education and the other was civics. And, I know there's this big thing to bring back civics education, and I think you're right. I mean, I think many people who vote in referendums do not fully understand that it was the intention of our constitution that you could change it, that you actually have amendments. So I do think people need to know more how our system works. But I don't think it's going back to, if you like, that old style, the civics engagement, the education that you and I might have had. I think the key thing that we should be doing with young people, including at schools, is to do with civic engagement, how they, in various ways, get involved in things that interest them. And yes, I do think it's, of course, important that, you know, they understand the basic structures and systems within which democracy works in Australia. But I don't think it's a straight matter of, you know, sitting them down for a few days and giving them a lesson on, you know, how Australian government works.
Kristy, anything to add to that? No. Okay, we're moving down to here, and then Peter Boehm, and then in the second row. Oh my goodness.
Hi.
Okay,
Hi.
we're going. Speak fast. One.
Thank you very much.
Boehm, three. Ros.
I want to know what your opinions are with regards to the idea that potentially the younger, lower than 40 years old part of the population neurologically have been changed to a very sort of dopamine-seeking, short-term, reward system-based type of thinking, and how we can instill the kinds of ideas and values of civil society which are gained in a very, very different way, not, you know, in a sort of very immediate reward system based thing. How those things are going to be able to be created so that they can compete with the high levels of the social media influence that the younger generation are experiencing. And you know, what suggestions do you might have on that?
So I quoted or cited Jonathan Haidt earlier because he is the social psychologist who is absolutely convinced that that has happened, and not exclusively, but predominantly through the introduction of the mobile phone. Where I think I differ is that I don't think you can just point the finger at young people. It is all of us. I was a little bit horrified today. I went out to get a coffee, and there was a mum and dad, because it's school holidays, and they obviously had their two daughters with them. I don't know, 6 and 8. They seem to be delightful young children. And as they sat down, the dad said, "Having a good time?" And she said, "Yes." And by the time he'd got there, he'd got his phone out. She came back from the coffee. She had her phone out. They're both sitting in front of their children with the phone. And you're thinking, really? You really need to do this for the next 10 minutes? So I think it's not generational. I think it has affected the way we relate. And some of us, most of us, I hope, don't realise how ugly, incidentally, it gets out there, and the dangers to which we expose young people. You know, again, to go back to Mike Baird, I remember when we had the first refugee arrive from Syria. You remember he had argued very courageously with Tony Abbott to increase the refugee intake. And it was a wonderful day. The family arrived. It was a great little media occasion, a delightful family. I went on the next day, Peter, to see how the media, so the media was okay. Actually, the formal media was all great. But then you get these streams of commentary that are attached. I've never been on since to look at that stream of commentary. It was just so ugly in its orientation. So yes, I think there's a problem, but I do not believe it is just generational.
Solutions to this one.
Yeah.
Geez.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm with Peter. I don't think it's just generational, and I think that thing about, you know, part of the response is how do you find the pause. I mean, even with work teams, it's like, turn off your notifications. You do not need your notifications on. I mean, it's like if your phone or your watch is buzzing, then actually it's you don't even think about it. And I think the coffee shop or the restaurant example is really a good one, because so often this is not even, we're not mindful of it. It's just it's just habitual. And there are ways to change habits. There are ways to change habits with intent, with change of behaviour, what's the outcome I seek, et cetera, et cetera. But part of that also means you have to be willing, where habits get broken is when you're also willing to change your identity. So part of the challenge is how do we create a society where the identity isn't so caught up in that immediacy of the response. And we do know, I mean, that Netflix doco on, you know, and I mean, you cited the book and there's some great research, but on the way that social media is designed to give you that hit, it's like find the pause. And actually, how many times do you notice when you go somewhere where it's like, I'm waiting for the coffee to come, I look at my phone. It's like, oh my God, I'm looking at my phone, put it away. Don't need it. It's really interesting challenge.
So, sorry, I do want to. So, I think about everything else. I also have a view that it's not the technology itself or the morality of the technology. It is, as with every other technology, the way we're actually using it. We got to remember. Do you remember 2011, Arab Spring? Isn't this great? Social media is producing this great surge of democracy in Middle East. What we didn't realise, of course, is the authoritarian rulers could use social media much more effectively.
Okay, we're going to move to Peter Bohm in that third line. Then it goes back in front, then Roz, then Stuart.
I'm Peter Bohm. I'm a distinguished fellow of this society. Can we return to democracy? Many, many years ago, Lord Hailsham produced a book called The Dilemma of Democracy, in which he said democracies are fragile and too often temporary. All our evidence around the world seems to be that democracy is in decline. America has been notably unsuccessful in imposing democracy on other countries, and we have evidence in many, many other countries that they're moving to the right. Why should we be confident that democracy will last?
2 words, I'm not. I am not confident. I think it is a real challenge. My own view, Peter, is democracy and democratic governance and the values that underlie it now have to be fought for. But it's not just pointing at authoritarian, totalitarian, autocratic leaders elsewhere. It's looking how we do things ourselves.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm with you on we've got to work at it. And I think making an assumption that anything's here to stay is not a great assumption, which is where you started, actually, Peter. And there are, we do know around democracy the principles of things that mean that you can maintain a good democratic kind of society, a good democracy. And it's like, who's keeping an eye on those? How are we talking about those principles as opposed to how are we talking about the party politics or the ideologies, I think is really important. And the final piece around that puzzle, I mean, the OECD has 12, the European OECD Reinforcing Democracy Initiative has 5 pillars. The OECD has 12, but they really do go back to, you can group them. And the question is, who's keeping an eye on those? How are we doing? Who's measuring that? And what are we doing to improve the metrics on are we holding to these principles? And who's holding who to account on this? I don't know. Who's doing that in Australia, Peter?
All right, well, then we'll go on to...
Is that right? Talking there? I've always been interested in the difference between myself and younger people up to 40 as to how they get the news. I watch the news, international news, Al Jazeera, BBC. I speak to the younger people, why don't you watch the news ever? And the answer has often been, we don't trust. They get their information from social media. And I said, but that could be just as influence. And I'm just wondering if you could comment, is this a lack of trust now in our society?
Well, I think the one thing that social media does is it gives you the opportunity to trust your peers much more than elsewhere you're getting the news, and that's very dangerous. I don't know whether you went on to TikTok because, like me, you like lip-sync rock music and dance moves. It was great. TikTok was great. Where TikTok has really gone wrong is then become something more than that, and it's become a way of sharing in 12 to 30-second grabs a view on what's happening in the world. And so you'll get thousands of people, and that is where you're getting your news very often.
Yes, and if you go through history and you look at how young people are portrayed in general, the youth of today is just a thing. It's always the youth of today. So I think we have to be cautious about that. And there's also a piece around there is a decline amongst a whole lot of generations, not necessarily really, really well educated people, but there's a decline amongst a lot of generations around the trust of news and media and journalists.
You know, having said that, the annual Lowy poll is very clear. Every poll you ever see on the question on democracy, that the level of support and commitment from people under 30 for democratic governance is significantly lower than for people over 65.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I just wanted to say is there sometimes is a young person issue. I mean, if you go under, if you bits lower than 30, but part of neurological development is young people will always trust their peers first. It's part of how you form your identity and you move away from other forms and groups. My parents think this, but I think that, and all of those things. That's part of how development happens. So this is part of all of this mix. Just makes it more and more complicated, though, probably. Doesn't answer your question.
Okay, we're going to go Ros, Stuart, Susan, and then at the back. And then there's 2 or 3 at the back. So we'll let... So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we'll stop.
Thanks, Kristy. And thanks... Peter and Kristy, I think it's a fantastic discussion. I'm Rosalind Croucher, for a few more months, President of the Australian Human Rights Commission. I was, the idea of civility and civil society, and this is a lament more than anything with a question thrown in, because that is what we've been asked to do. It's the sites of incivility, and quite a lot of what we've been talking about are the sites for incivility and the problems of the polarising that happens in that landscape. And the lament side of it, to me, is what I've observed as this intense loss of nuance, that the idea of that civil, respectful space for difference of opinion is lost with a loss of nuance, and the arrogance of self-opinion that is encouraged by the way that the social media world works, and this sense of legitimating any iota of bullshit that anybody wants to contribute in that instant gratification way, that what we lose is nuance, and through it we increase incivility. And I've had to navigate it very often in the world that I've inhabited for the last nearly 7 years, which is this sense of the conflict, that rights are in conflict. And every time I hear that, I say, no, rights intersect all the time. People intersect, civil issues intersect. It's not so much about conflict, but it's the principles by which we navigate those intersections of rights. And in my world, it's through mechanisms of proportionality and legitimate ways of navigating intersections, not conflict. And so I wondered how you felt we could progress that from that polarisation, which has been hugely exacerbated by the world of social media and all this arrogance that feeds into that space, and move through the pauses. I loved that dynamic, to that civil engagement, the debates, just debating, being on different sides of opinions, no matter what the opinions are, go for it. How we encourage that, particularly with kids, because they are in whom our future rests. If we can't generate and encourage nuance in the development of thinking of our kids and grandkids, then I think that polarisation will really just create more of, we will be in conflict rather than in a zone of
Can
nuance.
I just say, here, I support all of that. I do think that we can tackle that in part through education, not through civics education. It was a colleague of mine when I was Chancellor at Western Sydney University that said to me, and it stuck with me, what we don't want at university is to have safe spaces. We want to have brave spaces. And what he meant, and it's real, is we need to have places where people feel able to discuss the most sensitive issues, but feel safe to be able to do so and see that ideas are actually nuanced. So I do think education has got a great deal to do with it.
Yeah, here, Rosalind. And I think it was a great contribution. I think the nuance piece is just really important. I think there's two things on the education front and how we create these spaces to do it. One is an intellectual ability to engage in a debate, but I think that half of the problem I think only half of the problem solved if we just create a space to have the debate, because we know that the emotional response will still be strong. So it's like, how do we also give people the emotional response skills to go, well, that didn't feel very good. Let's talk about why that didn't feel very good. And then how do we talk about the fact that we can still have this debate and we can manage the emotional as well as the intellectual conversation to see and find the nuance. And I mean, both of those things are about finding the pause and how you delve down into those deep levels of listening.
Okay, now, Stuart.
Yes, hi, Stuart Midgley, member of the Society. I just, on a slightly different aspect, Rodney Cavalier, the former minister in the Rand government, wrote a paper about 20 years ago now, and he drew attention to the fact that with the collapse of many clubs and other forms of civil society over the last 30 years for various reasons, people have no longer been exposed to the traditional Westminster style of running a meeting and having people having their say and understanding there's people in the room who may not agree to you. And he suggested that was putting a big distance between the average person and the way politics manages itself in parliaments and in parties. And I'd take that a bit further and say I think starting in the 1990s, education and a lot of workplaces moved to a very group work, consensus-driven way of working, as opposed to an older, industrial, unionised workforce where they had their own meetings in those bases and all the rest of it. And I wonder if part of the contempt for organised politics is seeing these people shouting at each other and holding bits of paper over their heads and doing all these daft things to a population who are growing up in the world where you just get in a room with a group and you find a consensus position. And they look at people who don't do that and sort of think, well, what's wrong with them? And of course, they're usually in their own social group when they're achieving that consensus position. They're not mixing with people who are radically different to them. Do you think that distance, that lack of experience with that kind of formal resolution of conflict over politics is driving some of the disengagement?
Well, I think the fact that people are not engaging in those traditional ways is one of the big challenges for democracy. Now they're engaging in different ways. How do we build that into our system? I'm not sure, people shouting across each other at the chamber with pieces of paper on their head, etc., is actually more shouty than what's on social media. In fact, I would say that social media is more shouty. When I first went on, incidentally, I thought it was because people would do it anonymously. I was amazed to find how many people attach their names to things that I honestly believe if they were sitting in the audience we were discussing now, they wouldn't actually say, but is okay to put on social media. So I think, in a sense, both are shouty. I don't think, incidentally, it's just social media. I think now what's happening is social media is obviously influencing, if you like, traditional media, not least because traditional media is losing money, and therefore the investment in journalism is great. And increasingly, almost every journalist, from the time you start working, has got to be an opinion journalist. When I was a kid, there were 2 or 3 people who were opinion writers, and they'd have one page. Now it's like everybody's got to have an opinion in mainstream papers and on television.
I mean, I think just a couple of. I just want to be slightly provocative. You
can start now, yeah?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Again, continue to be provocative. I mean, there are, I think, how do we find spaces where you can have, civilised conversations is really important. I don't know that old school clubs and formats is what's going to be the thing to get us there. And I also would argue that our First Nations peoples have for 60,000 plus years had really great protocols around how you have different difficult conversations and land in a particular place that helps make progress from a governance perspective. So I just,
Susan, I'm going to leave you to have the last question because I feel very embarrassed that it's difficult to see at the back, and we've got 3 across the back. So can you stand up? Please stand up because I can hardly see you. I think, are there 3 questions or two there? Yeah, go ahead.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Jeremy. I'm 16, so a lot younger than some of the people in this audience.
Thank you, Jeremy.
My question is about this idea of the dichotomy, which was mentioned briefly earlier with one of the questions, that the dichotomy of political opinions is bad, and I can't agree more. The problem is that in all practicality, there is a dichotomy. There is 2-party system that we have in Australia, and there's a 2-party system we have in America, and pretty much everywhere there's a 2-party system, to be frank. And that makes it really hard to express our own nuanced policies on things like economic, social policy, Israel, Gaza, etc. Like, you can't physically express your opinions on all of those when you only have one choice. So I guess my ultimate question is, how would you express your diverse opinions and get a vote on all of these issues instead of a vote on just one?
It's a great question. I actually think the 2-party system, at least in Australia, is breaking down much more now, both at federal and state level. So you do get a greater range of views expressed, particularly through where there's upper chambers or senates. So in a way, I don't see that. And in a way, what that should be teaching us is about the need to negotiate across these party lines. I think there's something worse, though. It is that there is that concept of party division, which is now becoming extreme, and where very often the spokesmen for, if you like, the left and right tend to be at the far ends of that left and right, where you don't have compulsory voting. I think that's more problematic than in Australia, where we still have everybody going to the ballot box. And I just think that's such a protection. But we've got to make sure that we don't think that there's one view here and one view here, and which side am I in? You're quite right. What we've got to think is that all of these, in Rosalind's words, it's nuanced. We hold a variety of views on any issues, and there is always a large amount that cross over the person we're having the argument with.
Okay, and there's another one at the back, another very dark person back there.
I'm not dark. I'm Dorothy Hodnott.
I'm sorry, Dorothy.
I was a principal of a public disadvantaged high school for a very long time, with a very good record of moving young people from great disadvantage into further education. That's not what I'm going to talk about. What I see is that increasing numbers of young people, and other people as well, perhaps not to the same extent as in the United States, see themselves as cut off from the mainstream of society. And they're cut off economically and socially. The sort of kids that I dealt with in Western Sydney didn't participate in mainstream society at all. They didn't know they could often, and when they did enter into the mainstream, they needed quite a lot of mentoring and so on to assist them to get through the cultural barriers that were there to them. I'm speaking small c cultural barriers. I think that that's a problem. The social media, the use of social media, is a symptom of that alienation and that detachment, if you like, from the mainstream. And it's a way of giving voice to people who may not be heard in other contexts. I really think we've got a lot of division in our society, and one of those great divisions is now in the increasing inequity in education at a school level, and the funding inequity, which is mentioned all the time in the papers. Nothing much happening about that. That is actually building up a deep resentment among some people. We are quite a sort of bipolar society, according to the OECD, as we're increasingly the haves and have-nots. And some of that can be rectified through education, I really believe that. But the education has to be equitable. And so we need to address those issues quite dramatically. We need to give a voice to people who otherwise have no voice. They will take to the streets and cause havoc if they find no other way to give expression to their feelings. The the common good is a notion that's very far from the lives of increasing numbers of people in Australia.
Dorothy, you know I agree with you on 90% of things, but I'm not sure I'm quite with you on this. There is one, I think, appalling scar on our democratic governance, and that is our continuing treatment of First Nations people. But I've got to say, when I look back at the history of large-scale migration to this country over 75 years, one of the things that stands out is how wave after wave of new migrants, certainly through their children, has been able to grab that equal opportunity, what exists, which I think is a cornerstone of civil society. I do agree with you that I think it's diminishing in education, and I'm absolutely with you on where this will end, because the United States is it. When I came to Australia from the UK in 1972, if you looked at the Gini coefficient of equality, income equality, actually the United States and Australia were pretty similar. If you look at it now, if you take into account government transfer payments, Australia's still pretty good on that. But you see what's happened in the United States with the great the eating out of the great American middle class. And that really is the problem you see writ large in politics and in society in the United States. I don't think we're there. I share your worries, but I think I feel a little bit more positive on that.
Do you want to add anything to that?
The only thing I just want to add is I just want to acknowledge, like, if you're in the bottom quintile of socioeconomic status, it is so sticky. It's bloody hard to get out. And as a society, that's gotten worse in terms of like wealth inequality, income inequality, Gini coefficient, yeah, relative to America, not too bad. But we do have an issue around how we address some of the inequities and how do you actually shift some of the conditions to enable people to do the social mobility that you were actually talking about before, Peter, I think is really important and part of this puzzle.
Susan, you've got less than a minute to do your question.
Thank you, Susan Pond. I'd like to try and turn you to a more positive view of democracy, because we spent a lot of time talking about the problems, but wouldn't you rather be having this conversation sitting in a democracy than sitting in an autocratic society talking about the future of an autocratic society? Isn't an autocratic society more threatened by lots of things that you've talked about than a democratic? Because at least we can have this conversation.
Absolutely. And that's what I stand for. I mean, that's what I mean, to go back to what I said to Rosalind, in a way, this is a brave space where you can have these sort of conversations and we have different views and you can have them robustly. But of course, yes. And that's why I think, in fact, what we're struggling to protect here is not just democratic governance, but from my point of view, much more fundamentally, is the civil society and the values which support that. Yes.
And I won't keep anyone much later, except to say that this is just about the nuance. And I think it's dangerous to get into a conversation that then just polarizes, oh, whoa, this is terrible and we need to be really worried about this. Or everything's okay over here. And so I think part of the great thing about this is we can have these kind of conversations, and I don't think we should be completely despairing either. I think there are plenty of signs of positive. We know in bad times, in Australia, people come together and do incredible things. We see that in all sorts of crises. So I don't think that we're completely broken as a civil society. I think we still have representation in governments being elected. I do also think there is a piece around sometimes we get upset because our ideas of who should be elected are the things that don't get up, which is the whole point of democracy, hence the paradox piece. And I do think that, we're starting to have conversations, not just here, but with others across society, with journos, with civil society kind of groups, with media people and others who play different roles as intermediaries around how do you start to create new forms of assembly and how do we actually hear from voices that are otherwise not. So I think there is absolutely reason to be hopeful for this. And that we shouldn't leave with that sense of this has been a polarised conversation.
Well, thank you very, very much, Kristy. That's a terrific note to finish on. It's been quite a week in Australian politics, really, and our own civil society, I think, from the egregious details of Bruce Lehrmann's life that have come out in law courts, through the loss of civil society in a public space, religious problems. It really hasn't been great, and it's not too good internationally either. So having that sense of our talking seriously about these issues, but also to be lucky enough to have two people who have been archetypal contributors to our public sphere. Peter Shergold, he's been a secretary of a department, he's doing all of this work, you with your work, but also with a private body which was philanthropic, which has really been an amazingly important part of our structure. I think that's really important, and I think the fact that we had this very civilised, to use a debate this evening, where there obviously are differences of opinion, is really important. I, as a mathematical logician to start off with, actually rather value reason, perhaps slightly more than emotion. But I bow to the fact that emotion happens. I'm still worried, and my question was going to be, look, Cambridge Analytica, there is no doubt that there are threats to democracy which are not just people picking their influences, that the influences can really undermine democracy. I think Shoshana Zuboff's fantastic on that. But I think what we in this Royal Society are hoping to do is to bring contentious issues and to discuss them in the reasoned and even emotionally informed ways that you suggest, so that we could actually be a body which works across, because we're not just science, we're not just arts, we're right across now those areas. And I must say I'm very grateful that we've even had a 16-year-old. This is a real triumph for our events. So thank you all for joining us. I hand over to Susan to close the meeting.